The Watcher's Curse. Mark and Sarah Peterson had spent years searching for their dream home. It wasn't just about finding a house, it was about a fresh start, a new chapter in their lives. When they stumbled upon the colonial-style home on the quiet, tree-lined street in Westfield, New Jersey, they knew they had found something special. The house was beautiful, with white shutters, a sprawling front porch, and a spacious backyard where their children, Emily, 10, and Jacob, 7, could play. It had history, built in the early 1900s, but had been well maintained over the years. The moment they stepped inside, Mark was sold. "Look at this place," he had said excitedly. "It's perfect." Sarah agreed, at least, on the surface. But something about the house unsettled her. The air inside felt thick, as if it had been holding its breath for decades. The wooden floors creaked beneath their feet, the walls seemed unnaturally tall, and the windows, despite being large, let in less light than they should have. She convinced herself it was just nerves. After all, moving into a new place was always an adjustment. The first few days were spent unpacking, painting, and settling in. The kids ran from room to room, claiming their spaces, while Sarah arranged furniture and tried to make the house feel like home. But from the very first night, something felt off. Lying in bed, Sarah stared up at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house. Every time she closed her eyes, she had the overwhelming sense that someone was watching her. She turned to Mark, who was already fast asleep, then to the bedroom doorway, half expecting to see one of the kids standing there. Nothing. Sarah sighed and rolled over, telling herself it was just her imagination. The next morning, as she stepped outside to get the mail, she noticed something strange. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an envelope with no return address, no stamp. It was simply addressed to the Peterson family. Frowning, she opened it. The paper inside was thick, old-fashioned, almost like parchment. The handwriting was elegant and precise, written in deep black ink. The message was simple, yet deeply unsettling. "Welcome to your new home. I have watched over this house for generations. It is my duty to observe, to protect. I see all, I hear all. Do not change too much. Do not disturb what should remain as it is. I will be watching." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her first thought was that it was a prank. But something about the letter didn't sit right with her. Mark, when she showed it to him, just laughed. "It's just some weirdo messing with us," he said, tossing the letter onto the counter. "Maybe an old neighbor who thinks they still have a say in what happens here." "But how did it get in our mailbox?" Sarah asked. "There's no stamp. No postmark. They probably just dropped it off themselves. Look, I wouldn't worry about it. It's a joke, nothing more." Sarah forced a smile, trying to push away the unease curling in her stomach. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It started small, doors left open when she was sure she had closed them, lights flickering for no reason, objects moving slightly from where she had placed them. At night, she would wake up suddenly, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of their bed. Then, a second letter arrived. This time, it was even more personal. "You are making changes. The house does not like change. You are not alone. I see you, Emily. I see you, Jacob. Be careful where you play." Sarah dropped the letter as if it had burned her fingers. Someone was watching them. Someone knew their children's names. Her heart pounded as she rushed inside, locking the door behind her. She wanted to believe this was some elaborate joke, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The Watcher was real. And they were just getting started. Mark remained skeptical, brushing off the letters as a prank. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings, noticing the small, unsettling details that seemed to grow worse each day. The way the security lights outside flickered at random, even though Mark had replaced the bulbs. The strange, rhythmic tapping sounds in the walls, always in the same sequence, 3 slow taps, followed by 2 quick ones. The way she would turn off her room's light, only to find it on again moments later. Then there was the feeling of being watched. Always. No matter where she was in the house, she could sense unseen eyes fixed on her. Sometimes, she would catch a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow that disappeared the moment she turned her head. One night, she awoke suddenly, her body ice cold. The bedroom felt wrong. The air was heavy, charged with something she couldn't explain. Mark was sound asleep beside her, but she could hear whispers. They were faint, almost like the wind through the walls, but distinct enough to form words. She knows now. She feels us. She hears us. Sarah sat up, her breath caught in her throat. She strained to listen, but the whispers had already faded. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she turned toward the bedroom doorway, and froze. The door, which they always kept shut at night, was wide open. She stared into the darkness of the hallway, heart pounding. She could feel something standing just beyond the threshold, hidden in the shadows. And then, ever so softly, she heard it. 3 slow taps. 2 quick ones. Sarah didn't sleep the rest of the night. A second letter arrives. The next morning, as Sarah made coffee, she kept glancing toward the mailbox, dreading what she might find. Sure enough, when she finally forced herself to check, another envelope was waiting inside. It was identical to the first 2, no return address, no stamp. But this time, the message inside was much worse. I see you at night, wandering the halls. You look afraid. Do not be. The house knows you. It has accepted you, for now. But I am always watching. Sarah's stomach twisted. They had seen her. They had watched her in the night. She ran back inside and shoved the letter into Mark's hands. This time, he didn't laugh. Okay, he said, rubbing his face. This is getting weird. Maybe we should call the police. And say what? Sarah snapped. That someone's leaving creepy letters. They'll tell us it's a prank and move on. That won't stop whoever this is. Mark exhaled sharply, nodding. All right. Then I'm setting up cameras. If someone's sneaking onto our property, we'll catch them. He spent the entire afternoon installing security cameras at every entry point, front door, back door, and the driveway. He even placed motion sensors in the hallway. If they come back, we'll know, he said. But deep down, Sarah wasn't convinced that the cameras would make a difference. Because she was beginning to think that whoever, or whatever, was watching them wasn't outside. It was already inside. Emily's night terror. That night, Sarah tucked Emily and Jacob into bed, trying her best to act normal. Mommy, Emily whispered as Sarah pulled the blankets up to her chin. Is the man in the walls real? Sarah's blood ran cold. What? She asked carefully. What man, sweetheart? Emily frowned, as if she didn't understand why her mother was asking. The man in the walls, she repeated. I hear him at night. He talks to me. He says he watches us. Sarah struggled to keep her voice calm. Emily, what does he say to you? Emily hesitated before whispering, he says we can never leave. Sarah barely slept. The entire night, she kept an ear out for whispers, taps, or footsteps. But the house remained eerily silent. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., a loud crash shattered the stillness. Sarah bolted upright as the sound of running feet echoed down the hallway. She leapt out of bed and threw the door open. Emily was standing in the hallway, eyes wide open, staring at the wall. Emily. Sarah ran to her, shaking her shoulders gently. Sweetheart, what's wrong? What are you doing? Emily didn't respond. She was motionless, her gaze locked onto something unseen. And then, without looking at her mother, she whispered. "He's in the walls. Nowhere to run." The next morning, Mark checked the security footage. Nothing. Not a single figure. No movement. No sign of an intruder. But the cameras had picked up something else. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the motion sensors in the hallway had gone off. The footage showed Emily walking out of her bedroom, standing in the hallway, but she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood just behind her. Not a person, something tall and thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. It was watching her. And then, as Sarah rushed into the frame, the figure vanished into the wall. Mark stared at the screen, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered the only answer that felt right. "The Watcher." Mark was no longer in denial. After watching the security footage, seeing the shadowy figure standing behind Emily, watching her, he knew they were in serious trouble. "We need to get out of here," he said, pacing the kitchen the next morning. Sarah was silent, gripping a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Sarah?" Mark pressed. "Did you hear me? We have to leave. Now." She lifted her eyes slowly, her face pale. "I don't think we can." Mark's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then whispered. "I think the house won't let us. The doors won't open." It started as something simple. That afternoon, as Sarah tried to step outside to get the mail, the front door refused to budge. At first, she thought it was stuck, but no matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't move. "Mark," she called, her voice shaking. Mark ran over and grabbed the handle. He twisted, pulled, nothing. It was as if the door was part of the wall. He yanked harder, but the wood didn't so much as creak. Frowning, he hurried to the back door, same thing. All the windows sealed shut. The garage door jammed. The house had locked them in. The whispering walls. That night, Mark sat in the living room with his laptop, searching for anything, any history about the house, any past owners who had experienced similar things. Sarah, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. Something was wrong with the house. She could feel it. Every time she passed by a wall, she had the distinct feeling that something was inside. Watching. Listening. Waiting. She pressed her ear against the wall of the upstairs hallway. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, scratch, scratch, scratch. Sarah jerked back, her breath caught in her throat. The sound came from inside the wall. She stepped away slowly. Then, a voice whispered. "You can't leave." Sarah ran. Emily's friend. The next morning, Sarah found Emily sitting in her room, talking to the wall. "Sweetheart," she asked carefully. Emily didn't turn around. "I like him, Mommy," she said softly. Sarah's heart pounded. "Who?" Emily finally turned. Her face was blank. "The tall man," she said. "He lives in the walls. He says I belong to him now." Sarah backed out of the room, her entire body shaking. The house comes alive. That night, everything changed. At exactly 3:33 a.m., Sarah and Mark were jolted awake by a loud, deafening banging coming from inside the walls. The entire house shook as if something massive was trying to break free. Bang! 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 The sound traveled, moving from the hallway to the children's rooms. Then came the whispers. Thousands of overlapping voices, hissing, chanting, laughing. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "It's awake." The house was alive. The walls pulsed. The ceiling cracked. The floorboards groaned as if something was crawling underneath. Then, Emily started screaming. Sarah and Mark raced to their daughter's room. And froze. Emily was floating. She hovered in the air, her tiny body limp, as shadowy hands reached out from the walls, gripping her arms and legs. "No!" Sarah screamed, running forward. But the second she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Mark pounded on the door from the other side. "Sarah! Open it!" Sarah turned. The walls were moving. They breathed like living flesh, rippling as unseen things crawled beneath the surface. The whispers grew louder. Emily gasped, struggling, her eyes rolling back. "Let her go!" Sarah sobbed, grabbing her daughter's hand and pulling. The hands in the wall tightened their grip, then suddenly, they let go. Emily collapsed into Sarah's arms. And just like that, the whispers stopped. The house went silent. The door creaked open. Mark rushed in, grabbing them both. They ran. They didn't stop until they were downstairs, huddled together. Sarah held Emily close, her heart racing. "It let us go," she whispered. Mark swallowed. "No. It's not done yet." And deep in the walls, something laughed. Mark didn't sleep. After what had happened with Emily, after watching shadowy hands pull his daughter into the walls, he knew this wasn't just a haunting. This was a trap. Sarah sat in the corner of the living room, holding Emily tightly, rocking her gently. She hadn't said a word since the night before. The house was quiet now, but the silence was worse than the noise. It felt wrong. As if the house was waiting. Planning. Watching. The call that never happened. At sunrise, Mark grabbed his phone. "I'm calling for help." He dialed 911. The phone rang. And rang. And rang. Then, a voice answered. Not a dispatcher. Not a human voice. A deep, crackling whisper slithered through the phone speaker. "No one is coming." Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Who is this?" he demanded. The whisper laughed. Then, the call disconnected. Mark stared at the phone screen. The call history showed nothing. No outgoing call. No missed connection. As if the call had never happened. Mark's hands trembled. "We really are trapped," he whispered. "The house fights back." Mark decided to force their way out. He grabbed a hammer from the garage and swung it at the back door. Crack. The wood splintered. He hit it again. And again. Then, suddenly, the door repaired itself. The broken wood melted back together, smoothing over as if nothing had ever happened. Sarah gasped. "No," Mark whispered. "That's not possible." Desperate, he turned and swung at the window. The glass shattered. Then reassembled itself in front of his eyes. The jagged shards lifted off the floor and fused back into the frame, the crack sealing until the glass was perfect again. "Mark," Sarah whimpered, stepping backward. "The house won't let us go." Then, the walls exhaled. A long, slow breath. As if the house itself was alive. And it was hungry. Emily's warning. Emily suddenly sat up, her small hands clutching her mother's shirt. "Mommy, we have to hide." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Why, baby?" she whispered. Emily's wide eyes flickered toward the ceiling. "Because he's coming." Then, a thunderous boom echoed through the house. The lights flickered. The floor shook. And a deep, crawling voice whispered from inside the walls. "You cannot escape me." Mark grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her and Emily down the hallway. They had to find a place to hide. They had to stay ahead of whatever was coming. But the house shifted around them. The hallway seemed longer. The doors changed places. Rooms that had been there before no longer existed. The house was changing itself, trapping them inside its maze. The thing in the dark. They ran down the hallway, only to slam into a dead end. A solid wall. There had been a door here yesterday. Now, it was gone. Mark. Sarah sobbed. Then, the shadows moved. Something emerged from the darkness. Tall. Thin. Its limbs too long. Its eyes hollow pits of black. The thing from the walls. Mark pushed Sarah and Emily behind him. "Stay back," he shouted. The creature tilted its head. Then, it spoke. "You were chosen." Sarah's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" she whispered. The creature smiled, its jagged teeth stretching too wide. "The house needs you," it rasped. "You belong to it now." Then, the walls began to close in. The walls have hands. The drywall cracked open, revealing hands. Dozens. Hundreds. Reaching out. Grabbing. Pulling. Sarah screamed as fingers wrapped around her arms and legs, dragging her toward the wall. Mark punched and kicked, trying to pull her free. Emily cried, clutching her mother's leg. "Mommy, don't go." The hands tightened. Sarah felt herself sinking into the wall. The whispers grew deafening. Then, Emily reached up and touched the wall. The moment her little fingers pressed against the surface, everything stopped. The hands froze. The whispers died. The creature's head snapped toward Emily. And then, the walls screamed. Not just whispered. Not just breathed. Screamed. As if the house itself was in pain. Sarah fell forward onto the floor, gasping. Mark grabbed her, pulling her up. Emily stared at the wall, unfazed. "It doesn't want me to leave," she said softly. "But I don't belong to it." Then, the ceiling cracked open. And something started coming through. "It's not over yet." A grotesque, inhuman arm slithered down from the ceiling. A long, skeletal hand reached toward them. The shadows in the house thickened. Emily turned toward her parents. "We have to run. Now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Emily, and together with Mark, they bolted. The walls howled as the house tried to stop them. Doors slammed shut. The floor cracked beneath their feet. But then, Mark saw it. A doorway that hadn't been there before. A way out. He grabbed Sarah's hand, dragging her forward. They burst through the door. And everything went black. Mark hit the ground hard. For a moment, he couldn't move. The air was thick, almost solid, like stepping through a barrier of wet, suffocating tar. His ears rang. His vision blurred. Then he heard it. The house was screaming. Not just the whispers. Not just the distant moans from inside the walls. A deep, guttural, inhuman wail that shook the entire foundation. Sarah groaned next to him, clutching Emily tightly. They had made it through the door, but they weren't safe yet. They were still inside. The house is changing. When Mark blinked his vision clear, his stomach dropped. The house was no longer the same. The hallway they had just run through was gone. The walls twisted and stretched, reshaping themselves into something impossible. A staircase spiraled upward into darkness. Doors hung in midair, opening to nothing. The floor beneath them breathed, shifting like the ribcage of a living thing. And then, a voice. "You think you can leave?" The creature from the walls stepped forward. But now, it was bigger. Taller. Its arms were too long. Its face stretched wide, a jagged grin splitting open like a second mouth. It didn't just crawl from the shadows now. It was the shadows. It filled the house with its presence, wrapping itself around every door, every wall, every flickering light. "You belong to me now." Sarah gripped Emily tighter, stepping back. "No," Mark growled. "We're leaving." The creature laughed. Then, the floor caved in, falling into the abyss. Mark grabbed Sarah and Emily, but it was too late. The floor opened beneath them, and they plummeted into darkness. Falling, falling, falling. The air howled past them. The screams of thousands of voices echoed in the void. Then, they hit the ground. Hard. Mark gasped for air, his lungs burning. Sarah groaned beside him. Emily didn't make a sound. Sarah sat up in a panic, shaking her daughter. "Emily. Baby, wake up." For a moment, nothing. Then, Emily's eyes snapped open. But they were wrong. They were black. "Emily is changing." Sarah screamed. Emily's pupils had vanished. Her entire eyes were swallowed in darkness. She stared up at Sarah with a blank expression. Then, she smiled. "He's inside me now, Mommy." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. Emily tilted her head. "He said I belong to the house." Mark grabbed Emily's shoulders. "No, baby, fight it. You're stronger than him." Emily blinked. For a moment, her little face twisted in confusion. Then, she started to shake. She clutched her head. "It hurts, Daddy. It hurts." The walls around them pulsed. A deep rumbling laugh echoed through the darkness. "She is mine." The house tries to consume them. The shadows closed in. The air grew thick, suffocating. The walls rippled, covered in writhing black veins pulsing like living flesh. Hands emerged from the darkness, reaching for them. Emily screamed. "Mommy! Daddy! Help me!" Sarah sobbed, holding her tighter. "We won't let him take you, sweetheart." Mark's mind raced. Then he saw it. A door. It was far away, barely visible in the shifting shadows. A single wooden door standing alone in the darkness. A way out. "Sarah," he shouted. "We have to run." Sarah nodded, gripping Emily tightly. Then, they ran. The house screamed in fury. The floor cracked open behind them. The creature lunged. Its long, skeletal fingers scraped across the ground, dragging itself after them. Mark's heart pounded. The door was so close. The final escape. The door began to close. Mark pushed forward. Faster. The shadows swarmed around them. The hands grabbed at their legs. Emily shrieked as one clawed hand wrapped around her ankle. Sarah kicked it away. "Run!" Mark shouted. They leaped forward. And slammed through the door. The nightmare ends. Or does it? The second they crossed the threshold. Everything vanished. The screaming stopped. The air was normal again. The house was still. Mark gasped, sitting up. They were back in the living room. The walls were normal. The house looked exactly as it had when they moved in. As if nothing had ever happened. Mark turned to Sarah, his breathing heavy. "Did we?" Sarah held Emily close, tears streaming down her face. Emily blinked up at her mother. Her eyes were normal again. "Is it over?" she whispered. Mark looked around, his body still shaking. The house was silent. Then, he saw the front door. It was open. They could leave. Mark stood on weak legs and walked toward it. Sarah followed, carrying Emily. They stepped through the door, out into the bright morning light. Fresh air filled their lungs. Mark turned back to look at the house one last time. It was just a house. Nothing more. No movement. No whispers. No sign of the nightmare they had endured. Mark took a deep breath and looked at Sarah. "Let's never come back." She nodded. They turned away. And never looked back. Final scene, the house still watches. Long after they were gone, the house remained. It stood there, silent, waiting. Then, the front door creaked open. The air shuddered. And from inside the empty hallway, a whisper slithered through the air. "They'll be back." Then, the door slowly shut on its own. And the house waited. The vanishing room. The house stood at the edge of town, its silhouette broken and jagged against the night sky. No one had lived there for decades, yet the windows never collected dust, the front door never creaked, and the walls seemed to breathe with an unnatural stillness. Those who passed by claimed they heard faint whispers drifting from inside, murmurs of voices long forgotten, warning those who dared to listen. It was this legend that had drawn 5 people to its doorstep on a bitter autumn night. They weren't thrill-seekers or ghost hunters, they were investigators, realists who had spent years debunking myths and proving that every ghost story had a rational explanation. But this house was different. There was a room inside. A room that swallowed people whole. Nobody knew exactly which one, but the stories were consistent. People had entered and never come out. No screams, no signs of a struggle, just gone, as if the house had erased them from existence. But tonight, they would uncover the truth. The team arrives. James Calloway, the lead investigator, took a deep breath before pushing open the rusted gate. His team followed closely: Sarah, the historian, Mark, the cameraman, Olivia, the researcher, and Daniel, the skeptic. "Place is bigger than it looked in the photos," Mark muttered, adjusting his camera. "It's not the size that bothers me," Olivia whispered. "It's the quiet. No crickets, no wind. It's like the world stops at the property line." James ignored the eerie stillness and gestured toward the porch. "Let's move. The sooner we get inside, the sooner we figure out what's going on." The wooden steps groaned beneath their weight, the front door giving way with little resistance. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something damp, rotten, and almost sweet. The house was frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges, a grandfather clock standing motionless in the corner. No sign of vandalism, no signs of squatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for them. And then the whispers began. Faint at first, like a breeze slipping through cracks in the walls. But as they moved deeper inside, the whispers grew, overlapping in hushed tones, their words unintelligible but urgent. "James," Sarah hissed. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, pressing his hand against the wall. It was warm, as if something inside was alive. "Set up the cameras," he ordered. "We're not leaving until we find the source of this." The room calls. The house was 3 stories tall, with countless doors lining its hallways, each leading into darkened rooms filled with forgotten memories. But one door was different. At the end of the main corridor, half hidden in the shadows, stood a door that didn't belong. Unlike the others, this one was pristine, its wood unblemished, its handle polished as if frequently used. Daniel frowned. This door wasn't in the floor plan. The whispers swirled around them, growing frantic, pleading. Something inside the room wanted them to leave. And something else wanted them to stay. James reached out, his fingers barely brushing the doorknob when the entire house shuddered. The lights flickered. A deep groan vibrated through the walls, a sound like the house itself was breathing. Then, the door creaked open on its own. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of decay, of something long dead but never truly gone. The room beyond was pitch black, a void that seemed to stretch infinitely. Mark hesitated, lifting his camera. "James, we shouldn't go in there." But James had already stepped forward. Because inside that darkness, something was waiting. Something hungry. James stepped into the room first, his breath catching as the air inside wrapped around him like a cold, damp shroud. The darkness was suffocating, thicker than any natural shadow, swallowing even the light from Mark's camera. It was as if the room itself was absorbing illumination, drinking it in hungrily. The rest of the team hesitated at the threshold. "James, don't go too far," Sarah warned, her voice barely above a whisper. But James barely heard her. He was transfixed. The room was impossibly large, far bigger than the house should have allowed. The floor stretched endlessly beneath his feet, and the walls faded into an abyss. There was nothing, no furniture, no windows, just the void. Then the door slammed shut behind them. The sound was deafening, echoing through the darkness like a gunshot. Olivia screamed, whirling around to grab the handle, but there was none. "No, no, no," she gasped, pounding against the wood. Mark joined her, ramming his shoulder into the door. It was right here. The handle was just here. James spun back toward the room, his pulse thundering in his ears. Something was wrong. The space around them was shifting, moving like the slow breathing of some unseen creature. And then, the whispers started again. "The room breathes." They came from every direction, rising and falling in an unnatural rhythm, circling them like a storm. But this time, they weren't just gibberish. They were names. James stiffened. "Did you hear that?" The others nodded, their faces pale, eyes darting around wildly. The whispers were repeating their names. Over and over, voices overlapping, some pleading, some mocking. Some sounded eerily familiar, like distorted versions of their own voices, warped as if spoken by something that didn't understand how mouths were supposed to work. Then the floor shifted. Not a tremor, not a simple movement, it warped. James felt himself sink an inch, as if stepping into something softer than solid ground. He lifted his foot, but the floor pulled. His flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the dark just long enough to reveal hands. Hundreds of them, pale and lifeless, rising from the floor. Fingers gnarled, nails jagged, twisting as they reached for the group. They didn't just emerge from the floor. They were the floor. Sarah shrieked as a cold, skeletal hand wrapped around her ankle. She stumbled, kicking frantically, but the grip tightened, pulling her downward. James lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "Hold on." The hands multiplied, appearing from every angle. Mark swung his camera, smashing them apart, but more rose in their place, reaching, grasping. A sickening sound filled the air, a wet, dragging noise, like something slithering just beneath the surface. And then, from the center of the room, something else emerged. The things that came before. A face. Mouth too wide, eyes hollow, its skin stretched as if stitched together from different people. It smiled. It rose slowly, its head tilting in unnatural jerks, its grin widening as it locked its gaze on Olivia. The thing spoke, but its voice came from everywhere at once, layered with dozens of different tones. "You shouldn't be here." The hands gripping Olivia tightened, dragging her downward. She gasped, her scream choked off as the darkness swallowed her up to the waist. "No. No. Get her out." Sarah screamed. James and Mark grabbed Olivia's arms, pulling with all their strength. The floor resisted. It didn't want to let go. Then the thing laughed. Not a human sound. A deep, vibrating noise that crawled into their bones. It raised one long, skeletal finger and pointed, not at Olivia, but at Daniel. "No," Daniel whispered, taking a step back. "No, no." The floor beneath him split open. He vanished. One moment, he was there, struggling, then he was gone, yanked into the abyss without a sound. The floor sealed shut as if he had never existed. Silence. Then, a knock on the door. James spun, his heart hammering. The door that had disappeared was back. And on the other side, someone was knocking. "Daniel?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. A second knock. Then a third. Then, the door burst open. Something stepped through. Something wearing Daniel's face. The thing that looked like Daniel stepped into the room, its movements too smooth, too perfect, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its skin was pale, waxy, stretched too tightly over its bones. The eyes. They were empty. Sarah clutched James's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "That's not him." James didn't need to be told. Daniel's face was there, but everything else was wrong. His posture was too still, his chest didn't rise or fall. When he moved, his arms swayed unnaturally, like they weren't fully attached. And his mouth. His mouth was too wide. He smiled, revealing rows of teeth. Not human teeth, jagged, misaligned, yellowed and too many. His lips barely moved when he spoke, his voice layered, as if several people were speaking at once. "You brought me back," it whispered. The room shuddered. The walls groaned, the floor rippled beneath their feet like a living thing. The shadows pulsed, deepening into something thicker than darkness. Mark lifted his camera with trembling hands, pointing it at the thing. His breath hitched. "Guys. I don't think it has a shadow." James's blood ran cold. The thing took a step forward. The lights flickered violently. Sarah gasped, her grip on James tightening. "What do we do?" The thing tilted its head at her. Too fast. Too sharp. "You can't leave," it said softly. "You let me in. Now you're mine." Then it lunged. The run that led nowhere. James shoved Sarah backward just as the thing's arm stretched, its fingers elongating into grotesque claws. It swiped, missing Sarah by inches, its nails carving deep gashes into the wooden floor. "Run!" James bellowed. They turned and sprinted toward the door, but the moment they reached it, the room changed. The door was gone. Sarah slammed into the wall where it had been, gasping in horror. "No, no, no." Mark grabbed her shoulders. "It's a trick. It has to be a trick." The whispers began again, crawling up their spines like cold fingers. The walls shifted, warping like melting wax. The ceiling stretched upward, disappearing into an abyss of darkness. The room was expanding. But the thing was still right behind them. It crawled now, moving on all fours, its limbs bending in ways that defied nature. Its neck twisted, its head snapping from side to side as it watched them with those hollow eyes. Then, it opened its mouth wider. A terrible, choking noise filled the air, a guttural, rasping breath that wasn't coming from its throat. It was coming from everywhere. James grabbed Mark's camera, flipping it toward the thing. The screen flickered, and for a split second, he saw Daniel. The real one. Buried inside. His face, frozen in a silent scream, pressed beneath the thing's stretched skin. His mouth moved, mouthing words James couldn't hear. But James knew what he was saying. "Help me." The mirror in the dark. James turned away. He grabbed Sarah and Mark, shoving them toward the farthest wall. "We need to find another way." "There isn't one." Olivia sobbed. "We're trapped." But then, the shadows twitched. A shape formed in the wall. A rectangle. James's breath caught. A mirror. It was massive, stretching from floor to ceiling, its surface rippling like water. But it didn't reflect them. It reflected somewhere else. A hallway. And at the end of the hallway, a door. Mark grabbed James's arm. Are we really going to? We have no choice, James hissed. The thing howled. It was closer. Too close. Its arms stretched toward them, its skin splitting at the seams, revealing glimpses of the writhing, shifting things inside. James didn't hesitate. He jumped through the mirror. And the others followed. James didn't know if he was falling or being pulled. The mirror's surface wasn't glass. It was something else, something alive. It wrapped around him, squeezing like a cold, wet throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then he hit the floor. Hard. Gasping, James rolled onto his hands and knees. The air smelled wrong, a thick, metallic stench that made his stomach twist. Then he saw the others. Sarah, Olivia, and Mark lay sprawled around him, coughing, disoriented. But there was no sign of the thing. For a moment, relief flickered in James's chest. Then he looked around. They were still inside the house. But it was different. The walls were taller, stretching upward into endless darkness. The floor was no longer wood but cold stone, slick with some unidentifiable liquid. And the air. The air hummed, a low, throbbing vibration that made James's bones ache. Mark stumbled to his feet, clutching his camera like a lifeline. He panned it around, his breath coming in short gasps. Where the hell are we? James swallowed hard. I don't think we ever left. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Then where's the mirror? James turned. It was gone. The path of no return. The only thing in front of them was a hallway. A long, narrow corridor stretching into infinite darkness, lined with mirrors. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Each one distorted, warped. Some reflected the hallway, but others showed things that shouldn't exist. One mirror reflected them standing in the corridor, but their faces were missing. Another showed Daniel, trapped behind the glass, his mouth open in a soundless scream. His hands pressed against the surface, bloody and desperate. Sarah whimpered. I don't want to go in there. James exhaled sharply. Do we have a choice? Olivia's voice was barely a whisper. Something's watching us. James turned slowly. At first, he saw nothing. Then, the mirrors shifted. Their reflections moved. But they hadn't moved. James's stomach dropped. One of the reflections, his own, tilted its head at an unnatural angle. It was smiling. A wide, stretched, unnatural grin. Then it took a step forward. But James hadn't moved. He took an instinctive step back. And the reflection stepped out of the mirror. The thing in the glass. It wasn't just his reflection. All of their reflections were stepping out. Distorted, twisted versions of them. Their eyes were hollow, their faces stretched, their limbs too long. Mark's double twitched violently, his bones cracking as he turned his head too far to the side. Sarah's doppelganger grinned too widely, her lips peeling back to reveal gums and nothing else. Olivia's reflection crawled instead of walking, its arms bending the wrong way, its nails scraping the floor. And James's double. James's double had no eyes. Only empty, gaping holes. The air shook with whispers. You shouldn't have come here. You opened the door. Now you belong to us. James's heart pounded. Run. They bolted down the hallway, the whispers swelling into a deafening cacophony. The reflections pursued them, their footsteps not matching their own. James could hear his own double laughing. Sarah shrieked as her doppelganger lunged at her, fingers stretching into clawed hands. James grabbed her, yanking her forward just as the thing missed by inches. Mark gasped. The door. James looked ahead. A massive door loomed at the end of the hallway, impossibly tall, covered in scratches and handprints. But something was standing in front of it. Not a reflection. Not a shadow. Something worse. The thing that waits beyond the door. It was tall, inhumanly tall. Its head brushed the ceiling, its body wrapped in something that looked like skin. It had no face, just a smooth, blank expanse of flesh where its features should have been. But its arms were too many. They hung from its body, twitching, reaching, clawing at the air. Some were human. Some weren't. And then it spoke. Not with words. With every voice they had ever known. Their parents. Their friends. Their own voices. You should have never opened the door. James froze. He couldn't move. Couldn't think. And then the thing reached for him. Its fingers brushed his face. And James saw a vision burning into his mind. The truth. The house wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was a trap. A place that didn't just consume people, it replaced them. The things in the mirrors. The thing that wore Daniel's face. They weren't ghosts. They were the people who had come before. Trapped. Twisted. Changed into something else. And now it was their turn. James couldn't breathe. The creature's fingers weren't fingers at all, they were veins, tendons, and writhing nerves, burrowing under his skin, pulling something from him. His mind felt unraveling, as if his thoughts, memories, and very identity were being peeled away like layers of old wallpaper. The visions continued to burn through his skull. People, thousands of them, trapped behind glass. Their mouths open in eternal screams, yet no sound came out. Their eyes, hollowed out, empty voids. Their reflections, twisted monstrosities, crawling through the mirrors, wearing their faces like masks. And then James saw himself. Or at least, what he would become. A hollowed-out husk, standing in front of a mirror, its head twitching, jaw unhinging like a snake's. The thing that wore his skin turned, its eyeless sockets burning into him. It smiled. "Run, James." The voice came from somewhere far away. Sarah? Mark? Olivia? He couldn't tell anymore. He barely knew his own name. But then, he felt pain. His hand burned. James looked down. Sarah had grabbed his wrist, pressing something sharp against his palm, a shard of glass. The pain cut through the fog in his brain. The creature screamed, its many arms recoiling. And suddenly, James could move again. The door that should never open. "James, run!" Sarah's voice snapped him back to reality. The thing lurched forward, its arms reaching again, stretching. The air hummed violently, the sound of 1,000 voices speaking at once. James turned and bolted. Mark and Olivia were already slamming into the door at the end of the hall, their hands clawing at the rusted handle. But the door wouldn't budge. Mark let out a strangled cry. "It won't open." James looked back. The reflections were catching up. Their twisted doppelgangers were racing down the hall, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, their expressions frozen in a grotesque, unnatural grin. The thing behind them was getting closer. James's heart pounded. The door was their only chance. "Move," he shouted, rushing forward. Mark and Olivia staggered back as James slammed his entire weight against the door. It didn't budge. But the mirror next to it cracked. James's eyes widened. The mirrors. The mirrors were the key. He turned, searching the walls, and saw it. A single mirror that wasn't like the others. It wasn't warped. It wasn't distorted. It showed the real world. The hallway they had entered from. The room before the nightmare began. And the door on the other side was open, breaking the glass. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed the shard of glass from his hand and hurled it at the mirror. It shattered. And suddenly, the room collapsed. The mirrors along the walls shook violently, splintering. The air ripped apart, a deafening roar filling the corridor. The reflections screamed in unison, their mouths opening too wide, revealing rows of teeth that weren't human. The creature behind them let out a shriek, its many arms convulsing, its form glitching, as if it was struggling to hold its shape. James grabbed Sarah's hand. "Go." They raced toward the broken mirror. Mark jumped first, vanishing through the shattered glass. Olivia followed, her body flickering as she passed through. Sarah hesitated for only a second, then dived after them. James turned back just as the thing reached for him. Its fingers brushed his face. And James saw everything. 1,000 lifetimes. 1,000 souls. All trapped. All screaming. And then he jumped. The escape that wasn't. James hit the ground hard. The air felt normal. No humming. No whispers. Just the faint creaking of an old house settling. He gasped, rolling onto his side. Mark was sprawled across the floor, his chest heaving. Olivia was on her knees, staring at the broken mirror in silent horror. Sarah stood beside them, her face pale, her hands trembling. They had made it. They were back. James let out a shaky laugh. We did it." Sarah turned to him. Her face was ashen. "No," she whispered. James frowned. "What do you mean, no?" Sarah slowly raised a hand. James followed her gaze. And his heart stopped. The mirror wasn't broken. It was whole. And inside the glass, their reflections hadn't moved. They were still standing in the hallway on the other side. Watching them. Smiling. And then James's reflection tilted its head. It grinned. And walked away. The final horror. A cold, suffocating dread wrapped around James's lungs. They had escaped. But not really. Because the things in the mirrors had taken their place. Sarah backed away from the mirror, shaking. "James, what if we're not really?" The house creaked loudly. The walls shifted. Mark let out a sharp gasp. The door. James turned. And felt his stomach drop. The door they had come through was gone. The room was changing. The walls were stretching. The light outside dimmed, turning that same unnatural, inky black. James's chest tightened. They hadn't escaped. They had just stepped into another layer. A different part of the trap. And somewhere, in another mirror, their real selves were watching. And smiling. They would never leave.